how does how do changes in SID affect exposure? As SID increases, the image receptor exposure is going to decrease by the square of the distance. So there's a inverse relationship, but it's inverse squared relationship. That's why we call it inverse square law. So when we're talking about changes in SID, we've got to consider a couple of different things. One is image receptor exposure and occupational exposure, patient exposure. So your questions are going to come at you from two different directions. What happens to occupational exposure as distance increases, or what happens to image receptor exposure as distance increases? The answer to both of those questions are as SID increases or distance increases, then each one of those things will drop. Okay, so with that in mind, let's walk through it. So what happens to patient occupational exposure with an increase in distance? Distance assumed here is SID. So unless the question asks otherwise, assume anytime that you're talking about distance, it's going to be SID. OID is going to affect some things that we're going to talk about later in the semester, but for right now, what we're talking about is distance. If you just see distance, assume SID. So it's going to decrease. What law does it follow? That will be the inverse square law. As we increase SID, then we lose exposure according to the square of the distance. So how they affect tube output, or how those changes affect tube output, is they don't. And that assumes that you're not operating from automatic exposure. So it's really independent of tube output. Independent meaning that they're two totally different things. So, there's nothing magic in increasing the SID that affects your tube output. Changes in SID, increase in SID, you don't get a decrease in image receptor exposure with an increase in SID because the tube put out fewer photons. It's just that they spread out. We collimated them off the image receptor, and the anatomy of interest is catching and transmitting fewer photons. So that's the reason for the drop, not because the tube discontinued making more photons. And it's not even because the air filtered out some of those photons. It's just because the divergence of the central ray, the divergence of the X-ray beam increased, and then we collimated some of that off, so we lost photons. So when techniques are set, there's no change in tube output, but when we're using the AECs, remember the purpose for the AEC is to, or the function of the AECs is to count the X-ray photons, get to a certain amount, send a signal over to the timer circuit to discontinue exposure. So when we're using AECs, we do get an increase in tube output. We have to, and the purpose for the AECs is to reintroduce those photons that we lost with the increase in distance. So when we have a set technique, there's no change in tube output. When we're using AECs, it's adjusting to the increase in distance according to the inverse square law, the loss of photons, and it applies basically the direct square law. So it follows the inverse square law. As SID increases, exposure decreases by the square of the distance, change in distance. As SID decreases, then we get an increase in exposure according to the square of the change in distance. And I already talked about why it happens. That is because of the divergence of the central ray. As we increase distance, the beam spreads out more. We collimate down, and we lose some of the photons. We should always collimate. If we increase SID, we should always collimate to make sure that we don't overexpose the patient, overexpose tissues that don't need to be exposed. So if we have a properly collimated X-ray beam at 40 inches and we increase to 72, then what we're going to wind up with, if we're taking a chest X-ray on a patient, is their entire head and pretty much their entire abdomen is going to be exposed as well. So the purpose is to eliminate that radiation exposure, so we don't create scatter radiation, don't expose patients to radiation they don't need. So how do changes, or be it increase or decreases in distance, affect density? Again, that should be exposure. I'm just going to delete that because index number is next, and that is your exposure. How is it going to affect the index number? Well, if you increase your distance, the index number is going to indicate that you underexpose the patient. Again, this is assuming that we have no change in our technique. We're not phototiming. We didn't change our technique in response to change in distance. If we decrease our SID, then our index number is going to go up. It's not going to have any effect on contrast, any effect on scatter radiation, providing you use that collimation. Beam divergence. If we increase our SID, we're going to have a less divergent X-ray beam. That bears explanation. As we increase SID, then collimate, then our I'm introducing too much stuff to that. So beam divergence, let's just say this. As we increase our SID and we don't collimate, we're going to have a great increase in beam divergence. We'll talk more about that next semester. I'm going to change our penetration. It will, if we increase our SID, it will increase our sharpness of recorded detail. It's going to have no effect on our visibility of recorded detail. So those changes occur because of the inverse square law. We use the direct square law for technique changes when we have changes in SID. What technical factors should we change? And that's universally going to be mass. As SID increases, you need to increase your mass to maintain exposure. So that's a direct square law. Inverse square law, you increase, something decreases. With direct square law, you increase, you increase. So you need to pay attention to the questions on the test. I walked through this, I think, last week. So when you see a question that's asking about technique changes, so you increased your distance from 40 to 72 inches, what do you need to do with your technique? That would be increase mass. That would be a direct square law question. So if you increase from 40 inches to 72 inches, remember you're going to change your mass, and how much you're going to change your mass is by a factor of 3.24. So if you used one mass at 40 inches, then at 72 inches you're going to use 3.24. If you used two mass at 40 inches, just multiply the two by 3.24. That would be your new mass. So you're going to look for mass changes for use of direct square law, exposure changes for use of inverse square law. So you got exposed to 1 MR exposure at 2 feet. How much of an exposure are you going to have at 1 foot? Well, you double your distance, or you half your distance. That's factor 2. Then your radiation dose is going to go up by square that distance. So square being 2 times something, something times something. So 2 times 2 would be a factor of 4. So if you got 1 MR exposure at 2 feet, at 1 foot, you'd have MR exposure of 4. So you're looking for radiation exposure for inverse square law. You're looking for technique changes, mass changes in questions that you're using, or when you're going to apply your direct square law. So if you have an exposure of 40 inch, you have a good technique of 40 inches, and you use that at 72 inches, your dose or your exposure is going to be too low. So you need to change your exposure factor by 3.24. So you have 2 focal spots. You really have 1 bevel on the anode, and we'll talk about the bevel on the anode later in the semester and kind of draw that out. But what you have is 2 filaments. So you have 2 focal spots. We walked through the common sizes in the PowerPoint. Very small focal spot sizes would be fractional focal spots. We use those in special procedures. We use microfocal spots in mammo, and the purpose for those is to bring up sharpness of recorded detail. When we change from a large to small focal spot, then there should be no change in the number of x-rays produced. If your machine will allow you to make an exposure with a small focal spot, that it will allow you to make an exposure on a large focal spot, then you should have no change in image receptor exposure. You should have no change in tube output. So again, kind of like reciprocity, mass equals mass. 10 mass on a small focal spot should equal 10 mass on a large focal spot. There is one little caveat that you've got to keep in mind, and that is that some of your machines, most of your machines, are not going to let you make a large exposure or even a large MA exposure on a small focal spot, because that's just going to put too much heat on a small focal spot in your machine for safety of the tube and protection against exposures that you might try to make that would be harmful for the tube. It won't allow you to do that. So, where are we? Hang on, I gotta find myself. So, let's see, what effect does using a large MA on small focal spot have on tube life? And that's kind of what I was alluding to. That would be that it would shorten the tube life. So as a result, your MA stations are usually limited to 200 MA or lower for small focal spot. If you try to use too high of an MA on a small focal spot, what you're going to get is tube overload, and it won't let you make that exposure. So remember, we have two different types of filtration. We have inherent filtration and we have additive filtration. And for our purposes, what we're going to call inherent filtration is everything that you have to legally make an x-ray on a patient, a human patient. That is 2.5 millimeters of aluminum on any machine capable of making an exposure above 70 kVp. So every machine that you're going to use until you go to mammo, or if you go to mammo, is going to have that as its level of radiation. So that is going to include the glass or metal housing. It's going to include the oil inside the housing. The oil's outside of the x-ray tube, inside of the tube housing. The port, the mirror, and anything that you have to add to the beam to get it to 2.5 millimeters of aluminum. The purpose for that is for patient exposure, to reduce patient exposure. Absorb those low energy x-ray photons before they strike the patient and just add to entrance skin dose. So naturally, as you increase filtration, that entrance skin dose is going to go down even further. That's a question I think we'll get to later on. So how does it affect beam quality? Well, it eliminates those low energy photons, so what you're left with is higher energy photons. It increases beam quality. Unfortunately, we do lose numbers, so that's going to decrease quantity. It's going to decrease image receptor exposure. What we're left with is a more penetrating x-ray beam, and if we're using screens and films, what that would give us is a longer grayscale. It's going to decrease contrast, give us a longer grayscale. But since we are in a digital age, and that is controlled primarily with the computer algorithm, I'm going to take that out of there. Further reduce patient dose with more filtration. It's not going to do anything sharpness of recorded detail, and it's probably not going to do anything observable to visibility of recorded detail. But since we have a greater penetrating x-ray beam, then what we're going to have left is a little bit more scatter radiation. The scatter to PE ratio would increase with more penetrating x-ray beam, and could, if we were using screens and films, affect visibility of recorded detail, because it would affect your contrast. In a digital world, it's probably going to do nothing. So what we have to do to the technique, since we're going to lose numbers, is we have to add those numbers back in, and that would be, as filtration increases, we have to increase our mass. So all the things counted towards inherent filtration we talked about, with the exception of tanning. Inherent filtration does not remain constant through the life of the X-ray tube because with tanning, what we get is vaporization of the filament, laying down a layer of tungsten on the inside of the glass, and that's going to increase our inherent filtration over the tube life. Because of heat, we get an increase in inherent filtration. So again, what that does is it eliminates more of the low energy photons, and it pushes our brim spectrum towards the high energy side, but we do lose some of the overall numbers. So we get a decrease in numbers. The height of the bubble goes down, but it pushes it towards the high energy side. And where that minimum energies are represented, it pushes those towards the high energy side as well. Remember, filtration is the only thing that affects that minimum energy, the X-ray beam. So the different types of generators, you have single phase, and within single phase you have half wave rectification, we have full wave rectification, both with 100% voltage ripple. Then you get to three phase 6 pulse, which is 14%, three phase 12 pulse, which drops to 3%, high frequency after that, which drops to 1% or less. So they don't really affect contrast. You see a pattern here. Contrast is controlled by your computer algorithm. Don't really affect density, but they do affect exposure. So with image receptor exposure, with each one of those steps from single phase half wave to full wave to three phase 6 pulse, 12 pulse high frequency, each one of those in those order gives us a higher exposure. You're going to have a tendency to think of the amount of exposure change between single phase to three phase. It's a factor of 3, but it's not. It's a factor of 2. So with each one of those, if we didn't change our exposure factors between single phase and three phase, then the patient dose is going to go up. But what happens in the brim spectrum, especially when we get to three phase and high frequency, it pushes the brim spectrum towards a high energy side. Doesn't do anything to the peak energy, doesn't do anything to the minimum energy, pushes towards a high energy side, it increases the numbers. So if we adjust our technique, then our patient dose should go down because we have a higher quality X-ray beam. So percentage voltage ripple, we already talked about. Beam quality goes up, beam quantity goes up. We just talked about the brim spectrum. Image receptor exposure, if we did nothing with our technique, it would increase as well. But since it does so much, then we have to adjust our technique. So our technical factor adjustment needs to be masked. And again, it would seem like you would go from single phase to three phase. It'd be a factor of 3, but it's not. It's a factor of 2. So we need to adjust our technical factors by a factor of 2. If we go from single phase to three phase, our output increases by a factor of 2. So our technique needs to decrease by a factor of 2. Some of y'all are going to have a tendency to go in the opposite direction with this. So remember, as you increase pulses, okay, so back to inherent filtration. Inherent filtration does not remain consistent. No, we were on voltage ripple. I apologize. What technical factor adjustment needs to be made when changing from single phase to three phase? What you would need to change is mass. Since we get an increase in numbers from single phase to three phase, even though we also get an increase in average, we get an increase in numbers, we don't get an increase in peak. So we don't want to change our KVP. We want to change our mass. And if we're going from single phase to three phase, because we have a higher output with the three phase, we want to reduce our mass by a factor of 2. So if we're going from three phase to single phase, it goes in the opposite direction. Mass is still your change, but we're going to go from three phase to single phase, so we're going to have a decrease in output. And how we need to respond to that is with a increase in mass. So generators that have the highest output would be high frequency, and then the lowest would be single phase, specifically single phase half wave rectified. All right, so what should we use when setting a technique? That would be if we have to set a technique chart, that calipers that I mentioned before. Calipers are just this thing, you can see them in our lab, but they're just this thing that you would kind of place on either side of the anatomy to measure the thickness of the anatomy to determine how much of a technique that you would use based on the technique chart. So two things that you would use, both of which you're probably not seeing a whole lot in clinicals, one being a set of calipers and the other being a technique chart. So most of the time, whenever we adjust for pathology, it's going to be, regardless of whether it's pathology or patient size, a technical factor that we're going to use most of the time would be mass, especially with patient size where we've got an increase in soft tissue. But sometimes we can use KVP. Most of the time that we're going to use KVP is going to be whenever we have an increase in true density. So bone, if we have an overgrowth of bone, or we introduce something like a contrast media inside of the patient, we're going to need an increase in KVP. So usually, most of the time that we have an increase in thickness, that's going to be soft tissue. So we want to use mass rather than KVP because with soft tissue, we create a lot of scatter radiation. With the increase in KVP, we decrease the PEs relative to the scatter radiation. It kind of compounds the issue. So you can kind of think of it as KVP increases scatter, soft tissue increases scatter, add soft tissue, increase KVP, you're compounding the scatter issue. So we don't want to do that. We want to use mass. Tissue composition, we just talked about that. If it increases radiopacity, we might want to change KVP. So if it's fluid though, soft tissue or fluid is mass. We have two different types of pathologies. One will be additive, meaning we add tissue density, and the other would be destructive or subtractive. So most of the time with additive condition, it's going to be mass, but sometimes it could be KVP if our additive condition gives us a much higher bone density. With destructive, most of the time it's going to be, again, a reduction in mass. With additive, it's going to be an increase in mass. With destructive, it's going to be a decrease in mass. Sometimes we may want to use KVP for those destructive conditions as well. So again, anything that would reduce the bony density, if we have something like osteoporosis, then we might want to use a decrease in KVP. But most of the time it's going to be mass. Probably 9 times out of 10 it's going to be mass. What you're going to look for in technique changes for pathology is specifically if it increases radiopacity, if the pathology increases radiopacity in things like bone, casting material, then you might need an increase in KVP. So, destructive conditions. What would happen to our exposure if you mistook a destructive condition for an additive condition? So you walked into the patient's room, you see a big distended abdomen, and you assume that's all water, so you increase your technique, and it turns out the patient has a bowel obstruction where you should have potentially decreased your technique. What you're going to have is improper exposure to the image receptor. In the condition, or in the example that I just gave, what you would have is overexposure at the image receptor. So look over your list of pathologies that are in the Bushong book. So we already talked about that. Add bone, increase KVP possibly. Types of tissue creates most Compton, that would be soft tissue. Types of tissues create most PEs, that would be bone. anything with a very high effective atomic number. What needs to be adjusted when adjusted for patient size, it's got a lot of redundancy. Patient size is usually soft tissue, increased mass. What rule could you use to increase photoelectric interactions and maintain the same exposure? It's your 15% rule. What rule could you use to decrease photoelectric interactions and maintain patient exposure? All of these really are the same answer. That's 15% rule, 15% rule, 15% rule, 15% rule. How you reduce patient exposure to a pregnant patient would be to use the 15% rule, increase your KVP by 15%, and cut your mass in half. And we talked about that in class the other day. You might run into that eventually if you work a heavy ER load and you have a trauma patient who's pregnant. So radiographic quality is the characteristics on the radiograph that we'll want to see. Is the exposure proper? The density adequate? Do we have good radiographic contrast? Is there an absence of noise? That noise being either quantum model or an overabundance of fog. Are there any artifacts on the image? So a high quality radiograph would possess adequate density, high contrast without excessive fog or any kind of scatter or any kind of noise, and no artifacts. So optical density is the darkening of the image. That's how black or white the overall image is, but certainly also the sections of the image, how dark are the darks. So subject density is kind of like the hardness of the tissue. Air is less dense than fat, which is less dense than muscle, which is less dense than bone. So where we have high subject density, we're going to have low optical density. So bone is very dense, absorbs a whole lot of X-rays, and it's what shows up lightest on an X-ray. Air has very low density, so it shows up with a very high density on the image. So patient density, tissue density, and radiographic density are inversely proportional. Whatever gives us high radiographic density has very low tissue density. Contrast is the difference between those densities, and most of your questions are going to say something to the effect of contrast being difference in densities between adjacent structures. Resolution, we talked just a little bit about this earlier. We have spatial resolution, we have contrast resolution, sharpness of recorded detail. Contrast resolution would be analogous to visibility of recorded detail. So spatial resolution has to do with the lines. So most of the time in resolution, if you have no quantifier before resolution, you have to assume that we're talking about sharpness of recorded detail. That is spatial resolution. If you have a question that's asking about contrast resolution, it's always going to have that contrast in front of the resolution. So in the absence of any quantifier before resolution, always think sharpness of recorded detail, spatial resolution, geometric factors, lines, planes, angles, SID, OID, distances, focal spot size. All of that plays into spatial resolution. Contrast resolution is visibility of recorded detail. So the difference between those is just that. Recorded detail is the actual lines, and visibility is whether or not you can see it. So the analogy I like to make on this is that you can see, you get up and you go to clinicals on a clear morning, you can see everything that's in front of you very well. And if the next day you get up and it's a very foggy morning, just the presence of fog didn't remove any of that stuff that you could see the day before. It's just you can't see it anymore. So sharpness of recorded detail would be the trees and things that you could see on a clear morning. and on a foggy morning, your visibility is just shot. So the equipment or technical factors that affect both, we've kind of walked through that. The things that affect your visibility would be your collimation, your KVP, and your scatter cleanup grids, things like that. And the things that affect your sharpness recorded detail would be your SID, your OID, your focal spot size, blooming of the space charge, timer setting to make sure that you don't have motion artifact, all those sort of things. So we have two different types of noise. The most common that we see most of the time we have to deal with would be scatter radiation, so fog. And what creates fog or what causes excessive fog are those things that we talked about before. It's our technique. If we use a technique that creates more scatter radiation, higher KVP, then we're going to have more fog. If we are if we're using high KVP and no grid, then we're going to have more fog. If we don't collimate, we're going to have more fog. So that would be KVP and collimation and grid use. So what creates the fog and then what cleans up the fog. So quantum model is the other, and quantum model is just because of a lack of photon interaction on the image receptor. So the things that might cause quantum model are things that would cause our overall time to be really short, or our overall mass to be really short. If we're imaging very small anatomy, then we could have a problem with quantum model. We can have potentially, in part probably because of reciprocity failure, if we use very short exposure time, we could introduce quantum model. But if we use a very high KVP, remember that as KVP goes up for adequate exposure, we have perfect exposure with KVP and mass. If we increase KVP and we reduce our mass using the 15% rule, we can get our mass so low that we introduce quantum model. So we already walked through the different types of technique charts. Okay, so we already talked about technique charts. I'm going to go back through that again. So the most common manual technique chart is fixed KVP. Generally comes with a lower dose than the high KVP because the high KVP gets us to a threshold penetration, and then we adjust our mass. So it's an inherently lower KVP with a fixed KVP chart, and that unfortunately gives us a higher dose. So high KVP in contrast studies, especially using barium, manual technique chart, AEC, what type of manual chart? I think we already talked about that. That would be a fixed KVP. That would be the exposure adjusted when phototiming would be one of two things: selection of photocells, like what I talked about before, or using those +1 and +2 densities, -1, -2 densities. APR we already talked about. Positioning has to be best, or has to be accurate with AECs or APR. Okay, so magnification radiography. Okay, so magnification radiography we already talked about. Let's see. So the ways we calculate magnification we already talked about. The two things that affect magnification would be OID and SID. As OID increases, then we get an increase in magnification. As SID increases, we get a decrease in magnification. So with an increase in OID, we can increase SID to mitigate that. So magnification, when we have an increase in magnification, our sharpness of recorded detail suffers. There is a change in visibility of recorded detail with an increase in SID. So with the increase in OID, and that is due to the air gap, which we'll talk about later in the semester. That's size distortion. The things that affect distortion, we already talked about. Size distortion is also referred to magnification. Elongation, foreshortening, we already talked about. Really, of the two, what we get in more unequal magnification would be your foreshortening. So if my anatomy is parallel to the image receptor, and I tilt my anatomy, then one end of the anatomy is going to be at a greater distance from the image receptor, which is going to give us more magnification on that end. So either one can be referred to as unequal magnification, but of the two, foreshortening is going to be more obvious. Okay, so part thickness we already talked about. Further away from the central ray, okay, that's something we did not talk about. So if an object is directly in the middle of the central ray, then distortion is minimized. But because of the divergence of the central ray, if it's positioned out and away from the middle of the central ray, then what you're going to have is what we call a parallax effect. The parallax effect is going to affect it. The effect is going to be the parallax effect. Because of the divergence of the central ray, what's in the periphery is going to be projected as if we had an angulation in our central ray. So what is furthest out in the periphery is going to be affected more by angulation of that divergence of the central ray. That's basically the parallax effect. You can see the parallax effect most easily if you set up kind of a dummy patient in a fluoro room. So take something that's maybe cylindrical, maybe a cup, something like that. Take a needle or your pen maybe and poke it directly down into the cup, and then fluoro over the top of it and keep it within the fluoro field, but move the image receptor around, the image intensifier around, and see what happens to the projection of that needle or your pen sticking through that cup. It will change position. It will change in its the appearance of length. All of that will change as you fluoro around the periphery of it. And that's what's happening in the periphery of your X-ray beam, is whatever is being imaged in the periphery of the X-ray beam suffers from distortion every bit as much as if you had an angulation in the central ray. It has a parallax effect. Objects positioned not parallel to the image receptor, that's your foreshortening, elongation, central ray, and the image receptor as well. All right, so what are our three geometric factors? We'll just kind of walk through most of those. And those would be your magnification, so magnification being one geometric factor. Then you got focal spot blur, and then you've got distortion. So shape distortion, size distortion, focal spot blur would be your three geometric factors. Okay, down here. All right, so what three things should be lined up to minimize distortion? We'll walk through that. The central ray and the image receptor should be perpendicular, and the anatomy should be parallel to the image receptor. Size distortion would be OID and SID. A lot of redundancy in this. So focal spot blur. The focal spot blur is going to be a product of all of that, essentially. Anode heel effect, because of the angulation of the anode, the target area on the anode, what we're going to have are two different things. Because of the absorption characteristics of the anode, we're going to have a decrease in intensity on the anode end of the X-ray tube. and an increase in intensity on the cathode end of the X-ray tube. So the absorption of the anode is going to reduce intensity on the anode end of the X-ray tube. But also, though, what we're going to see is better sharpness of recorded detail on the anode end of the X-ray tube, less sharpness of recorded detail on the cathode end of the X-ray tube. I'll draw that out later in the semester on the board. So, difference between subject contrast, radiographic contrast, we've kind of done to death. Patient thickness and how that affects visibility really would be the scatter radiation type thing, and we've kind of done that to death. And to exposure here. So exposure, what happens as patient thickness goes up, we potentially lose visibility. Exposure does go down. How do we compensate for that? Again, we've got mass, a lot of redundancy. I got to go back through this thing again. How do different tissues affect contrast? Soft tissue, we're going to potentially lose some visibility. We will lose some exposure in tissues with higher effective atomic numbers and density. How can contrast be enhanced with low mass density structures? So how we can enhance the contrast really in screens and films, that was a lower KVP. But you could also use compression to try to spread some of that tissue out, try to spread it out and differentiate it and lower the thickness of the tissues so that you could better visualize those things. Effective atomic number, it depends on what the tissue type is, but as effective atomic number goes up, you get more absorption in that tissue. It should increase your contrast compared to lower effective atomic numbers. So shape can affect contrast. What we want is the shape of the anatomy to follow the divergence of the central ray. Otherwise, we can get what we call absorption blur, which gives us the appearance of decrease in contrast. What we get is, because of, if we have a tissue or let's say a bony structure that is pyramidical in shape and it follows the divergence of the central ray, then the widest portion of the anatomy is going to be closest to the image receptor, and we're going to have less blur. But if the widest portion is furthest away from the image receptor, we're going to have increased blur on the sides, and what that's going to give us is the appearance of a loss of contrast. So that's what we call absorption blur on the edges of a structure, and we'll talk more about that later in the semester too. Absorption blur is not on this test. So changes in KVP affect contrast. It really doesn't anymore. So just in a description, short grayscale means high contrast. Low contrast means long grayscale. High contrast is short grayscale, and long scale contrast is again long grayscale. Potentially, what things might affect a change in contrast would be a grid use. Anything that potentially would remove scatter radiation could potentially have some, if only negligible, effect on contrast. So grid use collimation could potentially affect. In reality, it's just not going to do a whole lot because your computer algorithm compensates an awful lot for that. So thinner patients, more contrast, thicker patients. You can actually see this in some cases with a very thick patient, very, very hypersthenic patient. What you'll see is you won't be able to visualize the kidneys very well. You'll lose a lot of contrast in that. So what you can do to the main things that you can do to affect a change in contrast are collimate and use grid. Two types of motion. What we have is voluntary and involuntary motion. With voluntary motion, good instructions to the patient. With involuntary motion, short exposure times. You might want to use reciprocity, increase MA, decrease exposure time to get to the same mass value. So we've talked about the tools. We've kind of done that to death. That would be your collimation, your grid use, accurate positioning, image receptor. Needs to be parallel to the anatomy, perpendicular to central ray. How to destroy image quality. We've kind of done that to death. Anything that you can use to improve image quality. If you don't do that, it's going to mess it up. Let's see, what can be done with exposure factors to improve image quality? Too high KVP potentially, theoretically, could create too much scatter radiation. So you want adequate KVP and adjust your mass. Again, can't say this enough, since KVP doesn't really affect your contrast all that much. I expect KVP to increase over time, and how that's going to affect the rest of the things that might mess up your image quality. With a higher KVP, you can use shorter exposure times, you can use lower MA, blooming goes away, motion artifact is decreased. So that's what I expect to happen, but for now, still, too much KVP creates too much scatter. Three groups of factors that will affect radiographic technique. You got patient factors, you got image quality factors. With patient factors, again, we've done this to death. I don't know why there's so much of it in here. So you want adequate penetration. If we have something that increases radiopacity, you may have to increase your KVP, but most of the time it's going to be increase your mass. I think when I wrote this, I was probably just trying to be comprehensive, but I think it's irritatingly redundant. How should we compensate with our technique? That's mass. Again, changes in patient thickness, mass, contrast, not much, but in theory, create more scatter radiation. Density or image receptor exposure would decrease. So we need to increase our mass, visibility, scatter radiation, sharpness for recorded detail. Again, the thickness could affect the OID, which could affect your sharpness for recorded detail. Pathology could affect density in the image receptor density. In this case, there is some validity to this. We took a look at the image, I think, of a patient with multiple myeloma, and you saw all those areas of increased density on the image receptor. So with pathology, it can affect our PE ratio so that we get fewer PEs most of the time. That's the way it's going to happen. It's going to be a destructive condition. So we get fewer PEs, and it increases the density of that particular tissue type. But it could be that we get an increase in Comptons if the pathology is something like pleural effusion, right? So again, two types of pathology: additive, destructive. Image quality factors: optical density, contrast, resolution would be what that's referring to. Anatomical density is inversely related to radiographic density. If we are overexposed, that means we use too much technique of some sort. So if penetration is adequate, and we adjust our mass. What we use, the two factors that we use to control our exposure are MA and time. And they don't really affect optical density. I'm going to delete that. But the kind of short answer to that is no, a lot of stuff affects image receptor exposure. Machine phase, KVP, SID, all of that affects image receptor exposure. So how much of a change in technical factors is required to see a difference in image receptor exposure to see any kind of meaningful change in image receptor exposure is 30%. But if we need to double our exposure, then we need to double our mass. So if, and I said meaningful here, but if it's meaningful enough that you need to repeat an exam, your minimum exposure change would be a 100% increase in mass. So if you underexpose a patient and you needed to repeat the image because of the underexposure, your minimum, the floor, the minimum amount of exposure change that you would need to make is a doubling of the mass. If you needed to repeat because you overexpose a patient, then you would cut your mass in half. So it's a factor of 2. We've already described the 15% rule. Define contrast, we've done that. How is contrast controlled? That's your computer algorithm. Some things that might slightly influence would be to use a grid, to collimate, make sure that you collimate. Use of a grid is going to decrease image receptor exposure, so you need to increase your mass. Compensate for density change. Exposure change. I thought I caught all this. I apologize for the wasted time correcting this. So you want to change your mass, not your KVP. And the reason that you don't want to change your KVP is because if the object here is to reduce scatter radiation, the effects of scatter radiation, fog on the image receptor, by using the grid, if you increase your KVP, then it becomes counterproductive. You create more scatter radiation that then you have to deal with. So your technique of choice for introduction of a grid would be to change your mass. Potentially filtration could decrease contrast, possibly changing machine phase, taking them to a different room from a single phase to a 3-phase room. Filtration is going to decrease your overall technique. So how would you compensate? Mass, for the same reasons that we talked about before. If you increase your KVP, you're already creating too much scatter radiation. Increase KVP, compound the problem. Difference between sharpness, we did that. 4 types of technique chart, we did that. Calculate magnification factor, field size. So some of these, to relieve some anxiety, there's very minimal math on this test, and what math there is, you should be able to calculate it in your head. Like if it's asking you for exposure changes with the increase in distance, I'm probably going to give you for this test, or I am going to give you for this test, something that you can come up with in your mind. You double the distance, your exposure goes down by a factor of 4. You change your distance from 40 inches to 72 inches, your technique correction is going to be 3.24. Things like that. So all of this, I think, is just review of the review. So I'm going to stop there and let you have this. So if you get a chance to review these two videos today, we'll talk about them in class tomorrow. Any questions that you might have that I possibly didn't cover in these two videos. So see you in the morning.